Okay, this is the second video for chapter 24, the urinary system. So we're going to take a microscopic look inside of the kidney and look at the nephron and what its role is in the urinary system. All right, so remember in the last video, I was going over the anatomy, the gross anatomy of the kidney and a little bit of the microscopic anatomy. But now we're going to zoom in even more and look at things here. So this lighter region is going to be at the top there. So remember, that's the cortex, renal cortex. And this darker region, then you can see the striations. This is going to be a renal pyramid that's in the renal medulla. And they actually have those labels over here that I just saw. All right, so what we have here is a nephron. There would be lots and lots and lots of nephrons located in this region all the way around the kidney, backwards and forwards. It's the nephron is going to start where this circular structure is, and then you can follow the tube, goes around really twisted, and then it's going to dip down. Sometimes it's really long, sometimes it's not, and then it'll come back up and it's twisted, and then it's going to dump into this thing here, which is called a collecting duct. So this thing, all the way from that round structure to here, is called a nephron. And these are your functional units of the kidney. And the reason they're called functional units is because this is where the function of the kidney is coming from. This is the part of the kidney that's going to actually filter the blood and form the urine. There are millions of these, or a little over a million at least, in every single kidney. So, you've got over 2.5 million about in your two kidneys. And there are two different regions here when we break it down a little more. There's a renal corpuscle, which is the circular region here. That's where filtration is going to take place, and we'll talk more about that. And then the renal tubule is the tube, so all of this light tan going down and up and all the twistiness from that end to this end. All that stuff in between. And this is where secretion occurs and the process of reabsorption. And we'll talk about both of those as well. Looking at things histologically under the microscope, you've got a section of cortex over here on the left. This is your renal corpuscle. You can see it's kind of a round structure. And what you're seeing here is cross sections through parts of the tubule. You've done a slice here this direction. And so you're seeing, this is where the fluid is going to be, is inside that lumen there. And those are cuboidal cells. You should probably recognize those. And then over here, you're looking at, this is going to be called the nephron loop, and we'll go over that in a minute. But here you're looking at maybe the collecting duct, which is this structure here. And again, looking at slices through the loops. So lots and lots and lots of tubes, lots and lots and lots of structures here. This picture in your book, I love this picture for some reasons and I hate it for others. But what we've got here is, again, you've got the cortex up above and the medulla down below. This region here is that circular region I was showing you earlier, the glomerular capsule. I don't think I've said that yet. The renal corpuscle is what I was calling it a few minutes ago. And all of this is the renal tubule. They've taken and stretched it out here and made it fairly linear. So remember how it's really twisted and twisty-turny in the region, and then it dips down and up, and then it's twisty-turny out here. So they've pulled it and stretched it out so that you're not seeing how twisted it is. Let's go back a couple slides so you know what I'm talking about. So you're not seeing all these twists, and you're not seeing all these twists. they've shortened this part, and then you see the dip down and up, and then they've shortened this and really stretched it out, pulled it straight so that you're not seeing all the twists. So just keep that in mind. It is really good for many, many, many reasons, but it's a little misleading as far as how long the renal tubule is. And one thing that is good here is they're reminding you this whole thing is a nephron from this end all the way over to this end. And then the nephron is made of the renal corpuscle, which is this part up here that I've put the blue box around, and then the renal tubule. And we will divide the renal tubule up into 3 distinct regions as well. So let's look closer at that nephron end. This is the renal corpuscle of the nephron, and the structure that you see on the inside here. Let me get a different color pen. Inside here, all of this. This is the glomerulus. What it is it's a whole bunch of capillaries. It's a big capillary bed that's enclosed in this spherical shape. These are fenestrated capillaries, and if you don't remember what that means, you should go back to the blood vessel chapter 20, and review that. Fenestrations mean that there are slit-like openings, like little windows in between the cells, and that's crucial to the function of this glomerulus and of the nephron. What's going to happen here is you also see that you've got blood coming into this area and then blood going out. So remember, your renal artery is going to go into your kidney to deliver blood, and then the renal vein is going to be how the blood exits the kidney. So you're deep, deep, deep inside. You've gone through all those different arteries to get to this point here. And then eventually you'll go back out. And we talked about that a little bit in the first video. So afferent and efferent, you've seen these words before. They're both arterioles technically, and the afferent arteriole is going to bring blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole is going to be how the blood exits after going through this glomerulus capillary bed. You will notice that the afferent arteriole is a wider diameter than the efferent arteriole. We'll talk about that later in the chapter. And the glomerular capsule, you see that over here, that is this outer layer of the glomerular, well, outside of the glomerulus. So it's the outer layer of the renal corpuscle. Lots of vocabulary in this chapter. So it does have a visceral layer and a parietal layer. The visceral layer is the layer touching the capillaries themselves, and then the parietal layer is the layer on the outside. So that's synonymous with those serous membrane layers that we've talked about before, but this is not a serous membrane. It's just the same terms. But it is epithelial in nature. So again, outer visceral and inner, sorry, I just said that backwards. Outer parietal and inner visceral. And what you're left with in between is a space, just like we saw in those serous membranes. So this region in here is space, and it's called the capsular space. You do not need to know the poles. So that's the renal corpuscle, the structure of it. Taking a closer look, so you're looking at those glomerular capillaries there. And then this is the magnified view here. What we've got here is the visceral layer is this outer surface that you see. You can see the capillary itself and the lumen of the capillary in there, and then you've got these weird looking, this is a cells on the outside. So these cells are called podocytes. So here's that term over here in the diagram. This is this large tan cell, and it's got some weird little wavy extensions, and it kind of spreads out looking like a starfish. These cytoplasmic extensions are called pedicels, ped like feet. And they are going to do what's called interdigitation, and that's like how puzzle pieces come together. Like if you clasped your fingers together, it's kind of like that. So the pedicels of one podocyte slide into place real close, but not quite on top of each other, with the next podocyte. So you're left with a little bit of space in between your puzzle pieces or your cells. Those are called filtration slits. And that's what's so important. You are able to filter the blood because you've got those little fenestrations in your capillaries. Materials are able to come from the capillary out through those little holes, and then they can squeeze through those filtration slits. And that's how you're going to filter material out of the blood into that space that we just talked about. So the filtrate is what it's going to be called. That's the name for the fluid. Once it's pushed out of your blood vessel, and it's going to enter that capsular space, and then from there, it's all going to come to here, and that's going to be the beginning of our renal tubule. That's the process of filtration. So all of that is happening here. This is the beginning of the renal tubule, and it's got 3 distinct regions. So you've got a proximal convoluted tubule, a nephron loop, and a distal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's near the glomerulus, distal because it's far away. If it was stretched out, you've got to remember that. They're showing it in that linear fashion, not all squished up on itself like it really occurs in nature. So just keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Convoluted because in real life it's twisting and turning and doing some weird stuff here. But remember, they've kind of pulled it out and shortened it here for this picture. And then, so you see convoluted on both ends. And then in the center is your nephron loop, center-ish is your nephron loop. And that's where the tubule is going to go down and then come back up. So it actually has a descending limb and an ascending limb. All right, let's take a look at this. So PCT is the abbreviation for proximal convoluted tubule. When we learn this in lab, please don't abbreviate. Make sure you always spell things out. Excuse me. And then the nephron loop has that descending limb and ascending limb. That's for the direction that the filtrate is taking as it moves through. And how it's going down into the medulla and then up back into the cortex. And then your distal convoluted tubule is the DCT. You've got a whole bunch of capillary networks that are going to be wrapping around all of these things, and you'll see those in some other pictures, kind of like this. So we'll get to those in just a minute, but those are real important for these processes of secretion and reabsorption along the length of the renal tubule. Kind of previewed in that last picture, you can see that there are different types of nephrons highlighted in this picture. So some of these nephrons are cortical nephrons. That's most of your nephrons. They look like this over here. They don't have very long nephron loops, and they're mostly up in the cortex. So it does dip down a little bit down there in that medulla, but most of it is contained up in the cortex. This is, again, most of your nephrons, and they're cortical nephrons because cortex. The other 15-ish% that you have in your kidneys are juxtamedullary nephron, and those are going to be longer loops, and they do diverge down into the medulla more so than the others. The glomerulus for those is usually farther down in the cortex, close to where you've got that division between the cortex and the medulla, instead of being up higher like this one. So you can see where those are positioned. And again, long loop into the medulla. These are going to be super important because of this right here in establishing the sodium chloride concentration gradient. And we're going to get into that a tiny bit more later on in the chapter, but you get a lot of sodium ions and chlorine ions, or chloride ions rather, doing some things in this loop, the nephron loop, in the juxtamedullary nephrons. Let's see. So then down, you've got at the other end, the distal end, you've got your distal convoluted tubule, and that distal convoluted tubule is going to empty into the collecting tubule first, and then the collecting duct. And you see the same thing here. So this is a collecting duct, getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it dives towards the center of the kidney, or towards that hilum or renal pelvis area. And these little branches coming off, those are the collecting tubules. There's another one that's actually connected over there. And then again, the collecting duct is this long piece in the center here. From there, I didn't put that picture here, but you can flip back through your book or your handout and look at that. But your collecting ducts are gonna empty into the papillary duct, and that papillary duct is located down at the base, I like to call it, of the renal pyramid, called that renal papilla. Remember, it's that little projection at the bottom of the renal pyramid, so down here at the bottom. So that's the papillary duct. And then from the papillary duct, you would empty into, let me get a different pen. Let's review. Remember, you've got at the tip of the renal papillae, you have the minor calyx, and then the major calyx, and then the renal pelvis, and then the ureter, and then it would get to the bladder, and then it would go to the urethra. All right. Let's see. There is a structure called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, another crazy term here, or JGA. Your book likes to abbreviate it. This is this couple things going on down here. So it's this stuff here in the diagram. So what this is kind of strange. You have to look at this part of the picture to understand what this is. Remember, here is your collecting duct. Your collecting tubule for this nephron is right here. Here is, they're not showing you all the blood vessels, but you've got your afferent and efferent arterioles, just like you see here. There's your renal corpuscle. This purple would be proximal convoluted tubule. This is your nephron loop. And in green here, this is your distal convoluted tubule. Remember what I was saying earlier, when it's all stretched out and pulled flat, this is farthest away from the glomerulus, or from the renal corpuscle. But in actuality, it's positioned like this. So part of that distal convoluted tubule is what you're seeing right here. Look at this. Somewhere they have this label. Oh, hold on. It's off the page. There it is, down there. Right here. Distal convoluted tubule. So this thing right here, that tan tube, is the distal convoluted tubule. It's what you're seeing right there. And so this thing here is the distal convoluted tubule that's been sliced so that you can see the inside of it. Crazy, I know. All right, so this apparatus is part of the distal convoluted tubule that's right here next to the afferent arteriole. And the afferent arteriole that's right next to it. So it's these two things right here. And what you've got here is a couple different cell types, and we'll go over those in just a second. But this is super important for regulating blood pressure and also for regulating filtration rate. And we'll go over that in a few minutes, but that's how fast you're making filtrate. Remember, pushing the fluid out through those slits and into that capsular space. So there's two cell types that are in very close direct contact with each other here. One cell type is in the distal convoluted tubule, and the other cell type is in the afferent arteriole. You've got granular cells in this afferent arteriole, and that's these pink cells right here. These are stretch receptors. That's going to become really important when we talk about blood pressure. They also secrete renin, and we have already talked about that, and I can't remember which chapter we learned that in. I think in the blood chapter. Either the blood chapter, I think it was the blood pressure, the blood vessel chapter, I think, is where we learned that. So we'll review that in a moment. And then your macula densa cells are these columnar shaped cells right here in the distal convoluted tubule. And those are going to monitor for changes in your sodium chloride concentration. So it's important to remember which cells detect or secrete the renin and detect stretch, and which cells detect the changes in the sodium chloride. The macula densa cells are also, they're literally connected, but they're also connected functionally wise as well. They're going to stimulate those renin cells, the granular cells, to release the renin that they make. So they're connected physiologically and anatomically. Blood flow. I thought I went over this in the last video, but I did not. Here it is. You're going to learn blood flow in lab. I'm going to briefly run through it here, but we will go into this in much more detail in the lab. And we'll get more into exactly the processes that are happening along the tubule as well. But let's talk about the blood flow first. You already know renal artery. Let's start there. So that's right here. Then as your renal artery enters the kidney, it's going to divide up into some segments. So these are segmental arteries, and you can have multiples there. Then we're following the path of the blood. So from there, you can see it keeps dividing, keeps dividing, keeps dividing. So when you divide and you go, remember these little structures between the pyramids? We're like between some lobes, right? This is interlobar, so between lobes of the kidney. Right in here. That's our interlobar arteries. And then it's going to turn and go across the top of an arc. An arc is like a rainbow shape. So that's going to be an arcuate artery. And this would go, that would be interlobar, and then this is arcuate. This is interlobar, and this is arcuate. So you see this all the way around the kidney. Off of the arcuate artery, you have these things kind of radiating out, right? So these are called cortical because we're in the cortex, radiate because we're radiating out into the cortex arteries. Or you can call them interlobular arteries. Same thing there. Lobes are bigger than lobules is the way to remember that, like we saw them in the lungs. So that's interlobular or cortical radiate arteries. And that is where you can see in this magnified view, that's the structure right here. This would be the arcuate. And then radiating out is our cortical radiate. That right there, look at there. That is where your afferent arteriole comes off of. So all along here. afferent arterioles to go to the glomerular capsule. So from the afferent arteriole, you go into the glomerulus, which is that capillary bed inside of that renal corpuscle. And then you come back out right here through the efferent arteriole. From there, it can diverge and you can get those other capillary beds. So peritubular capillaries are what's wrapped around your distal and proximal convoluted tubules. And then vasa recta is what you see here, looped around the nephron loop itself. So peritubular versus vasa recta. So that's the arteries bringing the blood to the glomerulus and then a little bit beyond. And then picking back up on that, you can see more of those vasa recta down there. And then it pretty much goes the same way out. There's one little exception, and that's debatable. So we're going to go back out through interlobular veins or cortical radiate veins. And you see those along here. And then the arcuate veins going across the tops of those pyramids, and then interlobar veins between the lobes. And then some books say that this is a segmental vein and some do not. Your book does not acknowledge that, but some books do, and the literature, they do exist. I don't know why they say it, they don't, but anyway, it's pretty common. And then your renal vein exiting the kidney. So that's your blood flow. We will do more of that with a lot of different models in the lab, so just sit tight on that. All right, so let's talk about the fluid. We've mentioned it briefly. Let's run through where all these things are and what it's called along the way. So the filtrate is going to be what you make during that process of filtration. Kind of makes sense, right? And that's that fluid that's going to accumulate in that green area that you see there in the capsular space. So through the pushing out of the fluid through those filtration slits into the capsular space, that's called filtrate. As the fluid then moves into the tubule, it's going to be called tubular fluid. And then so it's called tubular fluid all through proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, the collecting tubules, and the collecting duct, all called tubular fluid. Then when it exits that collecting duct and goes into that papillary duct, and here's a good anatomy review from that first video. Once it hits that, it's going to be urine. But everywhere else, it was either filtrate or tubular fluid. And then it's urine from here on out, literally, right? So until it gets out of your body. Okay, next video next.